Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. Inside the Mind of Jeffrey Dahmer, The Making of a Serial Killer, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, Early Life and Family Dynamics. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1960 to parents Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. He was the first of two sons born to the couple, who were both originally from the Midwest. Lionel was a chemist and Joyce was a housewife, and the family lived in a comfortable, suburban home. As a child, Dahmer was described as a quiet and introverted boy who preferred to keep to himself. He was not particularly outgoing or sociable and struggled to make friends. This may have been due in part to his family's frequent moves. By the time he was 8 years old, Dahmer had already lived in 6 different homes. Despite his shyness, Dahmer was a curious and intelligent child. He was especially interested in science and nature and enjoyed collecting rocks and insects. His father encouraged this interest and would take him on trips to the countryside to explore and learn about different plants and animals. However, there were also signs of trouble early on. Dahmer was prone to fits of anger and would sometimes lash out at his younger brother, David. He was also known to have a fascination with dead animals and would dissect them in order to learn more about their anatomy. This behavior was concerning to his parents, but they did not seek professional help at the time. As Dahmer entered his teenage years, he became even more withdrawn and isolated. He had difficulty making friends and fitting in with his peers, and began to spend more and more time alone in his room. His parents' marriage also began to deteriorate, and they eventually divorced when he was 18. Despite these challenges, Dahmer was able to graduate from high school and briefly attend college. However, he dropped out after just one semester, and his life began to spiral out of control. He began drinking heavily and experimenting with drugs, and was eventually arrested for indecent exposure in 1982. Looking back on Dahmer's early life, it's clear that there were warning signs that went unheeded. His family's frequent moves, his struggles with making friends, and his fascination with death and dissection may have been indicators of deeper problems. However, at the time, these behaviors were not taken seriously, and Dahmer was left to his own devices. This lack of intervention may have contributed to his later descent into violence and depravity. Chapter 2, Adolescent Years and the First Signs of Trouble. As Jeffrey Dahmer entered his teenage years, his behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. He continued to struggle with making friends and fitting in with his peers, and began to exhibit troubling behaviors that hinted at the violence and depravity to come. One of the earliest signs of trouble was Dahmer's fascination with dead animals. As a teenager, he would often collect roadkill and bring it home to dissect and study. He was particularly interested in the bones and internal organs of the animals, and would sometimes keep them as souvenirs. Dahmer's interest in death and dissection eventually escalated to the point where he began to seek out live animals to harm. He once impaled a dog's head on a stake in his backyard, and on another occasion, set fire to a pile of leaves in order to watch a group of frogs burn alive. Despite these disturbing behaviors, Dahmer's family and friends did not seem to take them seriously. He was known as a shy and introverted teenager, and his strange habits were often dismissed as harmless quirks. In fact, Dahmer's parents even encouraged his interest in science and nature, seeing it as a healthy outlet for his curiosity. However, there were other warning signs that were harder to ignore. Dahmer's grades began to slip, and he started to drink heavily and experiment with drugs. He was also arrested several times for petty crimes, including shoplifting and vandalism. As Dahmer's behavior became increasingly erratic, he began to withdraw from his family and friends. He stopped attending church, which had been a regular part of his upbringing, and stopped communicating with his father and stepmother altogether. Instead, he spent most of his time alone in his room, where he would listen to music and fantasize about violent and disturbing scenarios. Looking back on Dahmer's adolescent years, it's clear that there were many red flags that should have been addressed. His fascination with death and dissection, his declining academic performance, and his criminal behavior were all indicators of deeper issues that needed to be addressed. Unfortunately, Dahmer's family and community did not recognize the severity of his problems, and he was left to spiral out of control. Chapter 3: The Murders Begin. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Jeffrey Dahmer's behavior took a dark and sinister turn. He began to actively seek out victims, luring them into his home and subjecting them to unspeakable acts of violence and depravity. Dahmer's first known victim was Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker whom he picked up in 1978. He lured Hicks back to his parents' home, where he was living at the time, and offered him alcohol. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer bludgeoned him to death with a barbell and buried his body in the backyard. Over the next several years, Dahmer continued to prey on vulnerable young men, many of whom were people of color or members of the LGBTQ+ community. He would often lure them to his apartment under the pretense of offering them alcohol or drugs, and would then drug and strangle them. Once his victims were dead, Dahmer would engage in a series of gruesome rituals. He would often dismember their bodies, removing their limbs and organs and preserving them in jars or plastic bags. He would also engage in sexual acts with their corpses, sometimes taking photographs or video recordings of the acts. Despite the fact that Dahmer's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and violent, he managed to avoid detection for many years. He was able to convince his neighbors and acquaintances that he was a harmless and friendly man, and even convinced several of his victims' families that their loved ones had simply run away from home. However, Dahmer's luck eventually ran out. In 1991, one of his intended victims managed to escape and alert the police. When they arrived at Dahmer's apartment, they discovered a grisly scene: multiple dismembered bodies, along with evidence of cannibalism and necrophilia. Dahmer was eventually arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and other crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and was eventually beaten to death by another inmate in 1994. Looking back on Dahmer's killing spree, it's difficult to comprehend the sheer brutality and horror of his crimes. He was able to prey on vulnerable young men for years without being caught, and engaged in a series of horrific acts that defy comprehension. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human psyche, and the importance of remaining vigilant against the forces of evil. Chapter 4: The Psychology of a Serial Killer. What drives someone to commit acts of extreme violence and depravity? This is the question that has long fascinated psychologists and criminologists, and it is a question that is especially relevant when it comes to the case of Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer's behavior was disturbing and unusual from a young age, and it only grew more sinister as he entered adulthood. His fascination with death and dissection, his alienation from his peers, and his declining mental health all contributed to a perfect storm of darkness and violence. So what exactly was going on inside Dahmer's mind? What motivated him to commit such heinous acts? There is no one-size-fits-all answer to this question, as the psychology of serial killers is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. However, there are certain patterns and trends that can be observed when examining the behavior of someone like Dahmer. One key factor in the psychology of serial killers is the concept of fantasy. Many serial killers are driven by a deeply rooted fantasy life, in which they imagine themselves as powerful and dominant figures who can control the lives and bodies of others. For someone like Dahmer, who was deeply alienated from his peers and struggling with mental illness, these fantasies may have provided a sense of power and control that was otherwise lacking in his life. Another factor that may have contributed to Dahmer's behavior is a lack of empathy. Serial killers are often described as lacking in empathy, or the ability to understand and relate to the emotions of others. This can make it easier for them to inflict harm and engage in acts of extreme violence, as they do not feel the same emotional connection to their victims that most people do. Finally, it is worth considering the role of childhood trauma in the psychology of serial killers. Many serial killers have experienced traumatic events in their early lives, such as physical or sexual abuse, neglect, or abandonment. These experiences can leave deep psychological scars that can manifest in violent or destructive behavior later on. Of course, this is all speculation. It is impossible to say for certain what was going on inside Dahmer's mind. However, by examining the patterns and trends in the behavior of serial killers, we can begin to shed some light on the complex and troubling phenomenon of extreme violence and depravity. Chapter 5: Trial and Aftermath. In February of 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer went on trial for 15 counts of murder, along with numerous other charges related to his crimes. The trial was one of the most high-profile and sensationalized in American history, as the world grappled with the sheer horror of Dahmer's crimes. During the trial, prosecutors presented a wealth of evidence that painted a disturbing picture of Dahmer's behavior. They showed graphic photographs of his victims' remains, as well as detailed accounts of his rituals of dismemberment, necrophilia, and cannibalism. Dahmer's defense team argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, citing his long history of mental illness and his inability to control his behavior. However, the jury ultimately rejected this argument, finding Dahmer guilty on all counts and sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The aftermath of Dahmer's trial was marked by a sense of shock and horror. The world struggled to come to terms with the fact that such evil could exist, and many questioned how someone like Dahmer could have gone unnoticed for so long. There was also a renewed focus on mental health and the treatment of mental illness, as many people wondered how Dahmer's behavior could have gone unchecked for so many years. For the families of Dahmer's victims, the aftermath of the trial was a time of mourning and healing. They struggled to come to terms with the loss of their loved ones, and many found it difficult to find closure knowing that Dahmer would never be able to make amends for his crimes. In the years since Dahmer's trial and imprisonment, there has been ongoing debate about the role of mental illness in extreme acts of violence. Some argue that people like Dahmer are simply evil, and that mental illness is not a valid excuse for their behavior. Others believe that mental illness can play a significant role in shaping violent behavior, and that more needs to be done to identify and treat people who may be at risk for extreme violence. Whatever one's perspective on the matter, there is no denying the lasting impact of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human psyche, and the need for ongoing vigilance and attention to the warning signs of violence and depravity. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.